My son emptied my bank account and flew to Rome with his wife and her mother. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking, as every dollar I'd ever saved vanished in a single night. The next message I got wasn't an apology, it was a photo of them, smiling in front of the Colosseum, champagne in hand. "Thanks for everything, Mom," the caption read with a string of money emojis. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat in my kitchen, the silence pressing in, and realized my own son had stolen my future. But what they didn't know was that I was about to show them just how dangerous a mother with nothing left to lose could be. The bank's app glowed in my palm, the balance a perfect, merciless zero. I scrolled through the transactions, each one a knife, wire transfers, hotel bookings, luxury restaurants, all in Michael's name. My Michael, the boy I'd raised alone, the one I'd worked double shifts for, the one I'd given everything to. I called the bank, my voice trembling, and listened as a stranger explained that the transfers were authorized, that the money was gone, that there was nothing they could do. "Would you like to file a fraud report, Mrs. Walker?" the woman asked, her tone flat. I hung up without answering. The house felt colder than I remembered. I wandered from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the old piano, the faded photographs on the mantel. There was Michael at 5, grinning with a missing tooth. Michael at 12, holding his first baseball glove. Michael at 20, hugging me at his college graduation. I'd sold my mother's wedding ring to pay for that degree. I'd sold the family land to help him buy his first home. I'd never asked for anything in return. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Serena, my daughter-in-law. "Hope you're not too mad, Ruth. We needed a break. You always said family comes first. Don't worry, we'll send you a postcard. Ciao." There was a photo attached. Serena and her mother, Rhonda, shopping on the Via Condotti, arms full of designer bags. I stared at their smiles, at the money I'd spent a lifetime saving, now spent in a single week. I sat down in my old armchair, the one I'd bought with my first real paycheck, and let the numbness settle in. I thought of all the times Michael had brushed me off, all the times Serena had rolled her eyes at my old-fashioned ways. I thought of the last time I'd seen them, how distracted Michael had been, how Serena had barely looked up from her phone. I thought of the sacrifices I'd made, the meals I'd skipped, the nights I'd worked late, also Michael could have a better life. Outside, the world went on as if nothing had changed. The neighbor's dog barked, a delivery truck rumbled down the street, the sun shone on the roses Tom had planted for me. But inside, everything was different. I was alone, betrayed, and broke. But I was not defeated. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked to the kitchen. I poured myself a cup of tea, my hands still shaking, and sat at the table. I opened my notebook, the one I used for recipes and grocery lists, and wrote a single line. "This is not the end." I underlined it twice. I would not let Michael and Serena get away with this. I would not let them erase everything I'd worked for, everything Tom and I had built together. I didn't know what my next move would be, but I knew I wouldn't let this be the end of my story. I would find a way to fight back. I would make them regret ever thinking I was weak. As the sun climbed higher and the world outside went on, my devastation remained unresolved. The betrayal was raw, the pain fresh, but somewhere beneath it all, a spark of resolve began to flicker. I would show them that a mother's love, once betrayed, could become the most powerful force in the world. Earlier that week, my life had been quiet, almost peaceful. I woke each morning to the sound of birds, made myself tea, and tended the roses Tom had planted. I thought I knew my family. I thought I knew myself. But I was about to discover just how wrong I was. Ruth's house was a small, sunlit bungalow on a quiet street, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches and the mailman always stopped to chat. The front yard was a patchwork of wildflowers and roses, a living memory of Tom's green thumb and Ruth's patient care. Inside, the rooms were filled with the gentle clutter of a life well lived, shelves lined with books, faded photographs in silver frames, and the soft tick of the grandfather clock Tom had restored by hand. The kitchen was Ruth's favorite place, with its checkered curtains, worn wooden table, and the ever-present scent of cinnamon and coffee. Everywhere she looked, Ruth saw reminders of her late husband. the old armchair by the window, where Tom used to read the paper every morning. The toolbox in the garage, still organized just the way he liked it. And of course, the roses, a riot of color in the garden, lovingly maintained and rarely cut, a symbol of all the dreams they'd shared. Ruth had promised Tom she'd keep the house and garden alive, and she'd kept that promise, even when it meant scrimping on groceries or skipping a new winter coat. Ruth's role as the family matriarch was one she wore with quiet pride. She was the one who remembered every birthday, who baked the pies for Thanksgiving, who sent cards and small gifts for every occasion. Her son, Michael, was her only child, a boy who'd grown into a man with more ambition than patience, always chasing the next big thing. Michael had married Serena, a woman with expensive tastes and little interest in Ruth's stories or traditions. Serena was polite enough, but Ruth always felt a chill in her presence, as if she were being measured and found wanting. Serena took over the holidays, planned elaborate vacations, and made it clear that her own family came first. She was quick to dismiss Ruth's suggestions, to roll her eyes at old family recipes, to gently nudge Michael away from his mother's influence. Ruth tried not to mind, but it stung to be left out of decisions, to be treated as an afterthought in her own family. Michael and Serena had 2 children, Olivia and Ben, both in their teens. Olivia was bright and ambitious, always busy with school and friends, while Ben was quieter, more reserved, happiest when tinkering with gadgets in the garage. Ruth adored them both, but she often felt like a visitor in their lives, someone to be tolerated rather than cherished. She tried to stay involved, attending school plays, sending care packages, offering advice when asked, but more and more, she found herself on the outside looking in. Despite the distance, Ruth never stopped loving her family. She kept a scrapbook of every card, every photo, every note from her grandchildren. She made sure the house was always ready for visitors, just in case someone decided to drop by. She kept a pot of soup simmering on the stove, a plate of cookies on the counter, and a light in the window every night. She told herself that was enough, that being the quiet backbone of the family was its own reward. But sometimes, late at night, Ruth wondered what would happen if she stopped. If she stopped calling, stopped baking, stopped reminding them of all the little things that held them together. Would they notice? Would they care? Or would they simply move on, their lives unchanged by her absence? Ruth's sacrifices were woven into the fabric of her family's story, but they were rarely acknowledged. She remembered the years after Tom's passing, when Michael was still in college and money was tight. She'd taken on extra shifts at the hospital, skipped meals, and sold her mother's wedding ring to cover his tuition. When Michael and Serena married, Ruth paid for the flowers and the photographer, quietly covering the bills that Serena's family deemed unnecessary. She never complained, never asked for thanks, believing that love was shown through action, not words. But as time passed, Ruth began to notice the subtle ways she was being edged out of her own life. Serena's mother, Rhonda, became a frequent presence, always impeccably dressed, always quick with a backhanded compliment. "You're so good with simple things, Ruth," Rhonda would say, surveying Ruth's homemade pies with a patronizing smile. "I wish I had the time to bake, but you know how it is with real commitments." Ruth would smile politely, swallowing the sting, and retreat to the kitchen to wash the dishes alone. Family gatherings became more about Serena's family than Ruth's. Rhonda would regale everyone with stories of her travels, her charity work, her connections. Serena and Michael would nod along, laughing at Rhonda's jokes, while Ruth sat quietly at the end of the table, her stories left untold. Even Olivia and Ben seemed to gravitate toward their other grandmother, dazzled by her gifts and her glamorous tales. Ruth tried to remind herself that she was needed, that her quiet love mattered, but the feeling of being invisible grew with each passing year. Still, Ruth persisted. She sent Olivia care packages at college, filled with homemade cookies and handwritten notes. She helped Ben with his science projects, patiently explaining the difference between a resistor and a capacitor. She called Michael every Sunday, even when the conversations were short and distracted. She offered to babysit, to help with errands, to do anything that might make her family's life easier. But more and more her offers were politely declined. "We've got it covered, Mom," Michael would say. Don't worry about us. Ruth's world shrank to the walls of her home, her days filled with small routines and quiet memories. She found comfort in her garden, in the roses Tom had planted, in the birds that visited her feeder each morning. She kept her mind sharp with crossword puzzles and mystery novels, refusing to let herself become the old lady Serena and Rhonda seemed to expect. She paid her bills on time, balanced her checkbook, and kept meticulous records of every expense. But lately, Ruth had begun to sense that something was changing. Michael seemed more distracted than usual, his visits shorter, his conversations more guarded. Serena was always on her phone, whispering in the hallway or stepping outside to take calls. Ruth caught snippets of conversation, words like money, accounts, and she'll never notice. That made her uneasy. She tried to brush it off, telling herself she was being paranoid, but the feeling lingered. One evening, as she was preparing for bed, Ruth noticed a strange charge on her bank statement, an online transfer she didn't remember making. She called the bank, but the representative assured her it was probably just a mistake, a glitch in the system. Ruth made a note to check again in the morning, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next day, Ruth overheard Serena and Rhonda talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but Ruth caught enough to make her heart race. "She's never going to use that money," Serena whispered. "It's just sitting there, wasted. We deserve something nice for once." Rhonda laughed, her voice sharp. "She'll be fine. She's old. She doesn't need much." Ruth stood in the hallway, her hands clenched at her sides, her mind spinning. She realized in that moment that she had been too trusting, too willing to believe that her family would never hurt her. She felt a chill settle in her bones, a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. If only they knew what she was capable of. How much she noticed, how much she remembered, how fiercely she could fight when pushed. Ruth felt a slow burn of anger begin to replace her sadness. She was tired of being dismissed, tired of being taken for granted. She resolved to keep her eyes open, to trust her instincts, to be ready for whatever was coming. And as she stood in the quiet kitchen, the strange bank activity heavy on her mind, Ruth realized that the warmth of her home was giving way to a chill she couldn't ignore. Something was wrong, and she was determined to find out what it was, no matter what it cost her. Ruth's morning began with a sense of unease she couldn't quite name. She made her tea, glanced out the window at the dew on the roses, and tried to shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until she sat down at the kitchen table and opened her banking app that the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Her available balance was 0. She blinked, refreshed the app, and stared again. 0. Not a single dollar left. Her hands began to tremble, not from age but from a cold, creeping dread. She scrolled through the transaction history, her heart pounding harder with every line. Wire transfers, huge ones, gone in a matter of hours. $84,000, her entire life savings, vanished overnight. She pressed the phone to her ear, calling the bank, her voice shaking as she tried to explain. The representative was polite but distant, reading from a script. "The transfers were made online, Mrs. Walker. All authorized from your account. The funds went to an account in the name of Michael Walker." Ruth's breath caught. Michael, her only son. The boy she'd raised alone, the one she'd worked double shifts for, the one she'd given everything to. "Are you sure?" she whispered. But she already knew the answer. The bank offered to file a fraud report, but Ruth hung up before they finished their sentence. She sat in the kitchen, the ticking clock suddenly loud, the house too quiet, her world tilting on its axis. The phone buzzed again, a message from an unknown number. Ruth opened it and her heart twisted. It was a photo. Michael, his wife Serena, and Serena's mother, all three of them beaming in front of the Trevi Fountain in Rome. Champagne glasses in hand. Designer sunglasses, the caption reading, "Living our best life. Thanks for everything, Mom." There was a string of emojis, hearts, money bags, a winking face. Ruth stared at the screen, her hands numb. She scrolled through more photos. Michael and Serena at a rooftop restaurant. Serena's mother shopping on the Via Condotti. Michael grinning in a crisp white shirt, his arm around his wife. In every picture, Ruth saw the money she'd saved for decades, her security, her future, turned into someone else's holiday. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, the phone heavy in her hand, her mind racing through every memory, every sacrifice. She thought of the years she'd spent working as a nurse, the nights she'd skipped dinner so Michael could have new shoes, the family land she'd sold to pay for his college. She remembered the way he used to look at her, the way he'd say, "Don't worry. Mom, I'll take care of you someday." She remembered the last time she'd seen him, how distracted he'd seemed, how Serena had barely looked up from her phone. The silence in the house pressed in on her, broken only by the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Ruth stood up, her legs unsteady, and walked to the living room. On the mantel were photos of Michael as a boy, his first day of school, his high school graduation, the day he married Serena. She picked up one of the frames, her fingers tracing the glass. How could he do this? How could her own son steal from her, leave her with nothing, and then flaunt it for the world to see? The phone buzzed again. This time it was Serena, her tone as cold as the marble statues in her photos. "Hope you're not too mad, Ruth. We needed a break. You always said family comes first. Don't worry, we'll send you a postcard." "Ciao," Ruth's jaw clenched. She felt something inside her shift, not just heartbreak, but a cold, clear anger. She realized in that moment that she was done being the quiet, forgiving mother. She was done letting people walk all over her. She called Michael, her hands shaking. He answered, his voice full of laughter and background noise. "Mom, can this wait? We're about to go on a tour. Michael, you emptied my account. You took everything. How could you?" He sighed, annoyed. "Mom, you never used that money. Serena and I needed it. You're being selfish. We'll pay you back when we can. Don't make a scene." Ruth's voice was steady, but her heart was breaking. "You stole from me. You lied. You left me with nothing." Michael's voice hardened. "You'll be fine, Mom. You always are. I have to go." He hung up, leaving Ruth alone with her anger and her empty bank account. The betrayal was public and humiliating. She knew the neighbors would talk, that the family would whisper, that she would be the subject of pity and gossip. But as she sat in the quiet house, Ruth felt something new, a spark of resolve. She went to her bedroom, searching for any paperwork that might help her understand what had happened. In the back of her closet, she found an old lockbox she hadn't opened in years. Inside was a stack of letters from Tom, her late husband, and a folder marked, "For Ruth," in case of emergency. She opened it, her hands trembling, and found a document she didn't recognize. A legal agreement, signed by Tom and a lawyer, outlining a trust fund she'd never known about. Ruth stared at the paper, her mind racing. Was this the clue she needed? Was there more to her family's finances than she'd realized? As she read the fine print, a plan began to form. She would not let Michael and Serena get away with this. She would fight back, and she would make them regret ever thinking she was weak. But the worst was yet to come. Ruth's world shrank to the four walls of her home. She moved through her days in a fog, the betrayal gnawing at her from the inside out. Every time she passed the empty space in her bank account, she felt the loss anew, a hollow ache that no amount of baking or gardening could fill. She replayed her last conversation with Michael over and over, searching for some sign, some warning she should have seen. Had she really been so blind to his desperation, or had she simply chosen not to see it? The phone calls from Rome were infrequent and brief. Michael sounded distracted, always in a hurry, always promising to talk more when we get back. Serena never called at all. Instead, she posted photos online, her and Michael in front of the Trevi fountain, sipping wine at a sidewalk cafe, shopping on the Via Condotti. Ruth saw the comments from friends and family, the likes and heart emojis, and felt a fresh wave of humiliation. Everyone knew. Everyone saw her savings as nothing more than a means to an end, a ticket to a better life for Michael and Serena. The gossip started soon after. At the grocery store, Ruth overheard two women whispering near the produce aisle. "Did you hear about Ruth Walker's son? Drained her account and ran off to Europe. Poor thing. She must be losing her mind." At church, Mrs. Evans gave her a pitying look and pressed her hand a little too tightly. "If you ever need anything, dear, you know where to find me." Ruth forced a smile, but inside she was burning. She wanted to scream that she wasn't helpless, that she wasn't losing her mind, that she was still the same woman who had held her family together through every storm. But the worst was yet to come. A week after the bank call, Ruth received a letter from a lawyer representing a credit card company. The letter was cold and formal, demanding payment of a debt she hadn't known existed. If the debt wasn't settled, the company would pursue legal action to recover the funds. Ruth's hands shook as she read the letter. She realized that Michael hadn't just betrayed her, he'd put her at risk of losing everything. That night, Ruth sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread out before her, and let herself cry. She thought of Tom, of the promise she'd made to keep the family safe, of the life they'd built together. She remembered the way he used to hold her hand, the way he'd laugh when she got flour on her nose, the way he'd look at her as if she were the only person in the world. She missed him more than ever, missed his steady presence, his quiet strength. She wished he were here to tell her what to do. But as the tears dried, something inside Ruth shifted. She realized that she couldn't rely on anyone else to fix this, not Michael, not Serena, not even Tom's memory. She would have to stand up for herself, to fight for what was right, to protect the legacy she and Tom had built. She wiped her eyes, squared her shoulders, and began to make a plan. Ruth started by reaching out to the people who had always been in her corner, even when her own family had turned away. She called her old friend Marjorie, who had been her neighbor for over 30 years. Marjorie listened quietly as Ruth poured out the whole story: Michael's betrayal, the empty account, the mounting debts, the humiliation. "You can't let them get away with this, Ruth," Marjorie said, her voice fierce. "You've given enough. It's time to fight for yourself." With Marjorie's encouragement, Ruth began to gather her strength. She started keeping a journal, documenting every call, every message, every strange charge she found. She visited the bank in person, demanding copies of every transaction and asking pointed questions about the transfers. The manager, a young woman named Carla, was sympathetic. "You're not the first," she confided quietly. "We see this more and more, families taking advantage of the elderly. But you're smart to act quickly." Ruth's granddaughter, Olivia, became an unexpected ally. Olivia was home from college for the summer, and when she heard what had happened, she was furious. "Grandma, you can't let Dad and Serena walk all over you. I'll help you go through the paperwork. I'll help you talk to a lawyer." Together, they spent long evenings at the kitchen table, sorting through statements, highlighting suspicious charges, and piecing together the timeline of Michael's betrayal. Meanwhile, Serena's manipulations only intensified. She called Ruth, her tone syrupy sweet, pretending nothing was wrong. "We're having such a wonderful time, Ruth. You should see the view from our hotel. Michael says hi. Don't worry about the money. We'll pay you back as soon as we can." Ruth bit her tongue, refusing to give Serena the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, her anger simmered. The gossip in town grew louder. Ruth heard whispers at the pharmacy, saw the sideways glances at the post office. Some people offered sympathy, but others seemed to relish her downfall. "She always acted like she was better than everyone," one woman muttered as Ruth passed by. "Now look at her." Ruth held her head high, refusing to let their words break her. One evening, as Ruth was sorting through a box of Tom's old papers, she found a faded envelope tucked inside a book. Inside was a letter from Tom, written just before he died. In it, he apologized for the financial mess he'd left behind and urged Ruth to be careful with the family's money. "Trust your instincts," he wrote. "If something feels wrong, it probably is. And remember, you're stronger than you think." Ruth read the letter 3 times, her heart swelling with a mix of grief and resolve. She realized that Tom had seen this coming, that he'd known she would need to stand up for herself one day. She tucked the letter into her journal, a talisman against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. But the worst was yet to come. One night, as Ruth was drifting off to sleep, she overheard Olivia on the phone in the hallway. "Dad, you can't just take Grandma's money." "It's not right. I won't let you get away with it." There was a long pause, then Michael's voice, low and angry. "Stay out of this, Olivia. You don't know what you're talking about. This is family business." Ruth's heart pounded as she listened. She realized that the battle was just beginning and that she would need every ounce of strength, every ally, and every bit of courage she could muster to win. Ruth lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with everything she'd heard. Olivia's loyalty gave her hope, But Michael's coldness stung deeper than any gossip or legal threat. She thought of all the years she'd spent putting her family first, of the sacrifices she'd made, and wondered if any of it had ever truly mattered to them. But as the hours passed, her despair slowly gave way to determination. She would not let Michael and Serena destroy what she and Tom had built. She would not let them define her story. The next morning, Ruth called a lawyer recommended by Carla at the bank. She explained her situation, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. The lawyer listened carefully, then assured her that she had a strong case. "You have documentation, witnesses, and a clear pattern of financial abuse. We can fight this, Ruth, but you'll need to be brave." Ruth nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. She spent the next days gathering every piece of evidence she could find: bank statements, emails, Tom's letter, Olivia's testimony. She met with Marjorie and Carla, who both agreed to provide statements about Ruth's competence and independence. Even Ben, usually so quiet, sent her a text. "I'm with you, Grandma. Don't let them win." As Ruth prepared for the legal battle ahead, she found herself growing stronger. She realized that she was not alone, that she had allies who believed in her, who were willing to stand up and tell the truth. She started to see herself not as a victim, but as a survivor, a woman who had weathered storms before and would do so again. But as she filed the final documents with her lawyer, Ruth overheard Serena on the phone in the hallway, her voice sharp and panicked. "If she wins, we're finished. You need to find something, anything, to prove she's unfit." Ruth's blood ran cold. She realized that the fight was far from over and that Serena would stop at nothing to protect herself. Still, Ruth felt a new sense of resolve. She would not back down. She would not be erased. And as she closed her journal that night, she knew that the next chapter of her story was about to begin. Ruth's days became a blur of paperwork, meetings, and anxious waiting. She spent hours at her kitchen table, sorting through old files and bank statements, searching for anything that might help her case. The house felt emptier than ever, but she was no longer paralyzed by grief. Instead, she moved with a quiet determination, her mind sharper than it had been in years. She was done being the victim. She was ready to fight. One afternoon, as she was sifting through a box of Tom's old documents, Ruth found a faded envelope tucked inside a book. The handwriting was unmistakably Tom's. She opened it with trembling hands and discovered a notarized letter dated just months before his death. In it, Tom detailed a secret savings account he'd opened in Ruth's name, meant to be used only in an emergency. He wrote about his fears for the future, about wanting to protect her from hardship, and about his distrust of Michael's judgment with money. "If you ever need it, Ruth, go to First National and ask for the Walker Trust. It's yours and no one else's." Ruth's heart pounded as she read the letter again and again. She realized that not only had Michael betrayed her by draining her main account, but he'd also left her vulnerable to the debts and legal threats Serena was now orchestrating. But Tom had given her a lifeline, a secret reserve that could change everything. She called First National the next morning, her voice steady as she explained her situation. After a tense wait and a flurry of paperwork, the manager confirmed the account's existence. The balance was more than enough to cover her debts, her legal fees, and even to start over if she needed to. With this new strength, Ruth met with her lawyer, who was stunned by the discovery. "This changes everything, Ruth. With this account, you can pay off the debts and prove that you were never financially incompetent. And with the evidence of Michael's unauthorized transfers, we can challenge his actions and hold him accountable." Ruth felt a surge of hope. She paid off the credit card company immediately, her hands steady as she signed the forms. She gathered every piece of evidence: Tom's letter, the bank records, the emails, and Olivia's testimony. She met with Marjorie and Carla, who both agreed to testify on her behalf. Even Ben, who had always been quiet and withdrawn, offered to speak up for his grandmother. Meanwhile, Serena and Michael grew increasingly desperate. Serena tried to contact Ruth, her tone shifting from syrupy sweet to openly hostile. "You're making a mistake, Ruth. If you go through with this, you'll lose everything. You'll be alone." Ruth ignored her calls, letting Olivia and her lawyer handle any communication. She changed the locks on her doors, installed new security cameras, and made sure her neighbors knew to keep an eye out for anything unusual. Ruth's allies rallied around her. Marjorie organized a neighborhood petition in support of Ruth, gathering signatures from friends and neighbors who had known her for decades. Carla provided a detailed statement about Ruth's competence and independence. The pastor at church offered to testify, describing Ruth as a pillar of the community. Olivia and Ben stood by her side, their loyalty unwavering. But Ruth knew the fight wasn't over. She could feel Serena's desperation growing, could sense the way she watched the house from her car parked down the street, the way she questioned neighbors, the way she tried to turn the community against Ruth. The closer Ruth got to victory, the more dangerous Serena became. The night before the final hearing, Ruth sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of her life. She wrote a letter to Olivia, thanking her for her help, for her faith, for reminding her what family really meant. She wrote another to Tom, promising to honor his memory by fighting for the home and the life they had built together. She went to bed with a sense of peace, knowing she had done everything she could. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that Serena had one last move to play. The battle wasn't over yet. The real test was still to come. What Ruth had found would turn the whole case upside down. And as she closed her eyes, she knew that the next chapter of her story was about to begin. Ruth awoke before dawn, the house silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. She moved through her morning routine with a sense of calm purpose, her mind focused on the day ahead. She made a list of everything she needed to bring to court: Tom's letter, the trust account documents, the statements from Marjorie, Carla, and the pastor, and the timeline Olivia had helped her create. She packed them carefully into a folder, double-checking each item, her hands steady and sure. As she sipped her tea, Ruth glanced out the window and saw Serena's car parked across the street. Serena sat behind the wheel, her face tense, her eyes fixed on Ruth's house. Ruth felt a flicker of fear, but it was quickly replaced by resolve. She would not be intimidated. She would not let Serena's desperation shake her confidence. She finished her tea, straightened her cardigan, and went about her day. Later that morning, Ruth met with her lawyer one last time. Mr. Green reviewed the evidence, his expression growing more confident with each document. "You've done everything right, Ruth. You have the truth on your side. No matter what Serena tries, she can't erase the facts." Ruth nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for his support. She knew she couldn't have come this far without him, without Olivia, without her friends and neighbors. As the afternoon wore on, Ruth received a text from Olivia. "I'm proud of you, Grandma. I'll be there tomorrow, no matter what." Ruth smiled, her heart swelling with love. She realized that win or lose, she had already reclaimed something precious. Her own sense of worth, her place in the family, her right to be heard. But as evening fell, Ruth found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. "Back down, or you'll regret it." Ruth stared at the note, her heart pounding. For a moment, the old fear threatened to return, but she pushed it aside. She was done being intimidated. She tucked the note into her folder, another piece of evidence from Mr. Green. That night, Ruth sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of her life. She wrote in her journal, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, the heartbreak, the anger, the slow realization that she was stronger than she'd ever known. She thought of Tom, of the promise she'd made to protect their home and their legacy. She thought of Olivia and Ben, of Marjorie and Carla, of all the people who had stood by her side. As she prepared for bed, Ruth whispered a promise to herself, to Tom, to everyone who had ever doubted her: "I will not give up. I will not be erased. Tomorrow I fight." She lay down, her mind clear, her heart steady. She knew the battle would be hard, that Serena would do everything in her power to win. But Ruth was ready. She had the truth. She had her allies, and she had a strength she'd never known she possessed. The next day would bring the confrontation she'd been dreading and preparing for. But as Ruth drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of peace. She had done everything she could. Whatever happened next, she would face it with courage and dignity. Ruth's kitchen became a war room. The table covered in neat stacks of documents, color-coded folders, and a spiral notebook where she recorded every phone call, every conversation, every memory that might matter. She met with Mr. Green twice a week, reviewing the evidence, rehearsing her testimony, and strategizing for every possible scenario. Olivia was her right hand, scanning documents, organizing files, and even setting up a secure email account for Ruth to communicate with Mr. Green. Marjorie and Carla checked in regularly, offering advice and encouragement, their support a steady comfort as the court date drew near. Ruth felt herself changing. The fear and humiliation that had once paralyzed her were replaced by a sense of purpose. She was no longer just reacting, she was planning, anticipating, thinking several steps ahead. She learned to read legal documents, to ask the right questions, to trust her instincts. She started keeping a daily log, documenting her routines, her interactions, her thoughts. Each entry was a small act of defiance, a way of proving to herself and to anyone who might question her that she was still sharp, still capable, still in control. But Michael and Serena were relentless. They called Ruth at all hours, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. "You're making a mistake, Mom. If you go through with this, you'll lose everything. You'll be alone." Ruth stopped answering the phone, letting Olivia screen the calls. She changed the locks on her doors, installed new security cameras, and made sure her neighbors knew to keep an eye out for anything unusual. She even started carrying a small notebook in her purse, jotting down anything that seemed suspicious. The pressure mounted as the court date approached. Serena spread rumors at church, telling anyone who would listen that Ruth was losing her memory, that she'd left the stove on, that she'd gotten lost driving home. She tried to bribe Carla to say she'd seen Ruth acting confused. Carla refused, and instead wrote a letter for Ruth's case, describing her as the most competent and clear-headed person I know. Ruth was grateful, but she knew Serena wouldn't stop there. One afternoon, as Ruth was reviewing her notes, she received a call from Mr. Green. "I've filed motions to exclude any hearsay about your mental state," he said. "We have Dr. Patel's evaluation, Carla's letter, and the notarized statement from Tom's friend. But Serena's lawyer is aggressive. They'll try to rattle you on the stand. Be ready for anything." Ruth nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready, Mr. Green. I won't let them take my home." Olivia squeezed her hand. "You're stronger than you think, Grandma. You've already won by standing up for yourself." But Ruth knew the stakes. If this plan failed, she could lose everything, her home, her independence, her dignity. She spent the evenings walking through the house, touching the walls, the photographs, the quilt Tom's mother had made. She whispered promises to herself, to Tom, to Olivia. She would not give up. She would not be erased. Ruth's allies rallied around her. Marjorie organized a neighborhood petition in support of Ruth, gathering signatures from friends and neighbors who had known her for decades. Carla provided a detailed statement about Ruth's competence and independence. The pastor at church offered to testify, describing Ruth as a pillar of the community. Olivia and Ben stood by her side, their loyalty unwavering. Meanwhile, Serena's efforts to sabotage Ruth's case grew more desperate. She tried to contact Dr. Patel, hoping to sway his evaluation. She sent anonymous letters to the court, full of half-truths and outright lies. She even tried to turn Olivia against her grandmother, telling her that Ruth was confused and didn't know what she was doing. But Olivia stood firm, refusing to be manipulated. The tension in the house was palpable. Ruth found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, double-checking every lock, every window. She started sleeping with her phone on the nightstand, just in case. She knew Serena was watching, waiting for her to slip up. She saw Serena's car parked down the street more often, saw her talking to neighbors, sometimes even caught her peering through the hedge. Ruth refused to be intimidated, but the constant vigilance wore on her. The night before the trial, Ruth sat alone in the living room, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old clock. She reviewed her notes one last time, her hands steady, her mind clear. She thought of Tom, of the life they had built together, of the promise she had made to protect their home and their legacy. She thought of Olivia and Ben, of Marjorie and Carla, of all the people who had stood by her side. As she prepared for bed, Ruth found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. "Back down, or you'll regret it." Ruth stared at the note, her heart pounding. For a moment the old fear threatened to return, but she pushed it aside. She was done being intimidated. She tucked the note into her folder, another piece of evidence for Mr. Green. She stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street, the moonlight casting long shadows across the lawn. She whispered a promise to herself, to Tom, to everyone who had ever doubted her. "I will not give up. I will not be erased. Tomorrow I fight." She lay down, her mind clear, her heart steady. She knew the battle would be hard, that Serena would do everything in her power to win. But Ruth was ready. She had the truth. She had her allies, and she had a strength she'd never known she possessed. The next day would bring the confrontation she'd been dreading and preparing for. But as Ruth drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of peace. She had done everything she could. Whatever happened next, she would face it with courage and dignity. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and heavy, the sky threatening rain. Ruth dressed with care, choosing a navy skirt and a soft white blouse, Tom's old watch on her wrist. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had survived heartbreak, loss, and now betrayal. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out the door, Olivia and Marjorie at her side. The courthouse was already buzzing when they arrived. Neighbors lingered on the steps, some offering quiet encouragement, others just watching with curiosity. Inside, the courtroom was packed, family, friends, and strangers, all drawn by the spectacle of a family at war. Ruth felt their eyes on her as she entered, but she kept her gaze steady, her steps measured. She would not let them see her fear. Michael and Serena sat at the plaintiff's table, their lawyer beside them. Serena's expression was cold, her lips pressed into a thin line. Michael looked tired, his eyes darting around the room, never quite meeting Ruth's. Olivia sat behind Ruth, her face pale but determined. Marjorie and Mr. Green, Ruth's lawyer, sat with her, offering quiet words of encouragement. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. He looked at Ruth, his eyes lingering for a moment before he spoke. "Mrs. Walker, I must admit, I'm surprised to see you here. I've known your family for many years." Ruth nodded, her voice steady. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'm here to tell the truth." The proceedings began. Serena's lawyer stood first, painting a picture of Ruth as a frail, confused woman, unable to care for herself or her property. He cited concerns about her memory, her ability to manage finances, and her increasing isolation. Serena nodded along, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Ruth listened, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding. She wanted to shout, to protest, but she waited. She knew her turn would come. Michael was called to the stand. He spoke in a low voice, describing his mother as forgetful, overwhelmed, and in need of help. He talked about missed appointments, misplaced bills, and the burden of maintaining the house. Ruth felt each word like a blow, but she refused to look away. Serena took the stand next. She was poised, her answers rehearsed. "We only want what's best for Ruth," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We're worried about her safety. The house is too much for her. We just want her to be comfortable." The judge listened, his expression unreadable. When Serena finished, Mr. Green stood and began his cross-examination. "Mrs. Walker, do you have any evidence that Ruth is unable to care for herself?" Serena hesitated. "Well, she's left the stove on a few times. She's gotten lost driving home. Do you have any documentation of these incidents?" "Police reports? Medical records?" Serena faltered. "No, but thank you." No further questions. Ruth's turn came. She stood, her hands trembling only slightly as she took the oath. Mr. Green guided her through her testimony, asking about her daily routines, her finances, her relationships. Ruth answered clearly, describing how she managed her bills, maintained the house, and stayed active in the community. She spoke of her garden, her volunteer work, her friendships. Mr. Green presented the evidence, the original deed, Tom's letter, the security footage of Serena rifling through the recycling, the emails Olivia had found, the letter from Dr. Patel attesting to Ruth's mental fitness. He called neighbors and friends, each one describing Ruth as sharp, independent, and fully capable. Then came the turning point. Mr. Green played the security footage for the court. The room watched in silence as Serena appeared on the screen. Digging through Ruth's recycling, pocketing documents, Mr. Green presented the stills. The missing bank statement, the insurance letter. Serena's face went pale. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Walker, can you explain why you were searching through your mother-in-law's personal papers?" Serena stammered, her composure slipping. I was just trying to help. I thought she might have misplaced something important." Mr. Green pressed on. "Is it true you asked Dr. Patel to declare Ruth incompetent, even though he found no evidence of cognitive decline?" Serena's voice shook. "I was worried. Or were you trying to build a case to take her home?" The judge intervened. "That's enough. Mrs. Walker, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Ruth stood, her voice clear and strong. "Your Honor, I have spent my life caring for my family. I have managed this house, my finances, and my health without help. I am not helpless. I am not incompetent. I am here because I refuse to be erased from my own life." The judge nodded, his face grave. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker." The courtroom was silent. Michael looked down, shame flickering across his face. Olivia reached for Ruth's hand, squeezing it tightly. Marjorie smiled, tears in her eyes. During the recess, the courtroom buzzed with whispers and speculation. Ruth sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap, her mind replaying every word, every look, every moment that had led to this day. She glanced at Olivia, who offered a reassuring smile, and at Marjorie, who squeezed her shoulder. Mr. Green leaned in, his voice low and steady. "You did beautifully, Ruth. The judge saw the truth. Now we just have to hold our ground." Across the aisle, Serena was in heated conversation with her lawyer, her face flushed with anger and fear. Michael sat slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, the weight of his choices finally settling on his shoulders. Ruth felt a pang of sadness for her son, but she knew she couldn't save him from the consequences of his actions. He would have to find his own way back. When the judge returned, the room fell silent once more. He called Serena back to the stand. "Mrs. Walker, you've been accused of tampering with evidence and attempting to manipulate medical testimony. Do you have anything further to say?" Serena's voice was barely audible. "I was just trying to protect my family. I thought I was doing the right thing." The judge's gaze was stern. "Protecting your family does not mean destroying someone else's life. The evidence shows a clear pattern of manipulation and deceit. This court does not take such actions lightly." Mr. Green called Olivia to the stand. She spoke with quiet conviction, describing her grandmother's daily routines, her sharp memory, her kindness and independence. "My grandma is the strongest person I know," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's always been there for us. She doesn't deserve this." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to Olivia's testimony. She realized in that moment that she was not alone. She had allies, people who believed in her, who were willing to stand up and tell the truth. The judge asked Ruth one final question. "Mrs. Walker, if the court rules in your favor, what will you do?" Ruth took a deep breath. "I will continue to live in my home. I will care for my garden, volunteer at the community center, and spend time with my family, those who want to be part of my life. I will not hold grudges, but I will not forget what has happened here. I hope we can all learn from this and move forward." The judge nodded, clearly moved by her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Walker." As the closing arguments began, Ruth listened intently. Mr. Green spoke with passion and clarity, laying out the facts, the evidence, the truth. Serena's lawyer tried to sow doubt, to paint Ruth as stubborn and unreasonable, but the case was already lost. The truth was too strong, the evidence too clear. When the judge announced that he would deliver his verdict the next morning, a hush fell over the courtroom. Ruth felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but also a sense of relief. She had done everything she could. The outcome was out of her hands now. As she left the courthouse, Ruth glanced back at Serena and Michael. Serena's face was hard, her eyes cold. Michael looked lost, a man adrift in a storm of his own making. Ruth felt a surge of compassion for him, but she knew she couldn't fix what was broken between them. Not yet. Outside, the sky was clearing, the sun breaking through the clouds. Ruth took a deep breath. feeling the weight of the day lift from her shoulders. She was tired, but she was also free. She had told her story, fought her battle, and reclaimed her life. No one expected what happened next. The judge's decision would change everything, but for now, Ruth allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to savor the strength she had found within herself. The next morning, Ruth woke before dawn, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. She dressed in her favorite cardigan, the one Tom had always said brought out the blue in her eyes, and made herself a cup of tea. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the weight of what was to come. She sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around her mug, and tried to steady her nerves. Today, everything would change, one way or another. Olivia arrived just after sunrise, her presence a balm to Ruth's frayed nerves. "No matter what happens, you've already won," she whispered, squeezing Ruth's hand. Marjorie joined them, her smile warm and reassuring. "You're the bravest person I know, Ruth. I'm proud to call you my friend." Ruth smiled, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. Whatever the judge decided, she knew she had already reclaimed something precious, her own sense of worth. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. Neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers had come to witness the outcome. Ruth walked in with her head held high, her steps steady. She felt the eyes on her, but this time she didn't shrink from their gaze. She was no longer the frightened woman who had been blindsided by betrayal. She was Ruth Walker, mother, grandmother, survivor. The judge entered, his expression grave. He looked at Ruth, then at Serena and Michael, and finally at the assembled crowd. "This case has been difficult," he began, his voice steady. "It is never easy to see a family divided, to witness the pain that comes when trust is broken. But the law is clear, and the evidence is overwhelming." He turned to Ruth. "Mrs. Walker, you have demonstrated not only your competence, but your resilience, your integrity, and your unwavering commitment to your family and your home. The court finds in your favor. The house remains yours, and all attempts to remove you from it must cease immediately. The funds taken from your account must be returned, and the trust established by your late husband is to be honored." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes, relief and joy flooding her heart. She looked at Olivia, who grinned and threw her arms around her. Marjorie hugged her tightly, whispering, "You did it, Ruth. You did it." The judge wasn't finished. He turned to Serena and Michael, his tone stern. "Your actions have caused unnecessary pain and division. The court strongly recommends family counseling and urges you to reflect on the consequences of your choices. This is not just a legal matter, it is a matter of the heart." Serena's face was pale, her eyes downcast. Michael looked at Ruth, shame and regret etched into his features. For a moment, Ruth saw the boy he had once been, the son she had loved so fiercely. She felt a pang of sadness for what had been lost, but also a glimmer of hope for what might still be repaired. As the courtroom emptied, people stopped to congratulate Ruth, to shake her hand, to thank her for her courage. Mr. Green pressed a note into her palm. "You reminded us all what real strength looks like." The pastor from church hugged her, promising to visit soon. Even Ben, usually so withdrawn, sent her a text. "I'm proud of you, Grandma. Don't let them win." But the most surprising moment came when Michael approached her, his eyes brimming with tears. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I let you down. I let Serena come between us. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try to make things right." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, her heart aching with love and sorrow. "We can't change the past, Michael, but we can choose what we do next. I want to try too." The days that followed were filled with a quiet, almost surreal sense of relief. Ruth returned home to find her neighbors had left flowers on her porch and a casserole waiting in her fridge. She moved through her house with a new appreciation for every creak in the floorboards, every sunbeam that filtered through the curtains. The fear that had haunted her for months was gone, replaced by a cautious hope. She spent long afternoons in her garden, tending the roses and thinking about the future, not just the past. Michael began to visit more often, sometimes bringing Ben, sometimes coming alone. Their conversations were awkward at first, full of apologies and silences, but gradually they found their way back to each other. Ruth forgave him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She saw the regret in his eyes, the way he tried to make amends, and she knew that healing would take time. Serena, for her part, kept her distance. She sent a letter of apology, but Ruth sensed it was more about saving face than true remorse. Still, she accepted it, choosing to let go of the bitterness that had threatened to consume her. One evening, as Ruth was closing up the house, she heard a knock at the door. It was Olivia, her granddaughter, holding a small envelope and looking uncertain. "I heard what happened, Grandma. I'm sorry I wasn't here for you. Can I stay for a while?" Ruth welcomed her in, her heart swelling with gratitude. They sat together late into the night, sharing stories, laughter, and tears. For the first time in years, Ruth felt her family coming back together. Not perfectly, not all at once, but in small, hopeful steps. The community center where Ruth volunteered offered her a new opportunity to lead a support group for women facing family betrayal and legal battles. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to share her story so publicly. But Olivia encouraged her, reminding her of the strength she had shown. Ruth agreed, and soon found herself surrounded by women who saw her not just as a survivor, but as a guide. She listened to their stories, offered advice, and found healing in helping others. One afternoon, as she was preparing for a group meeting, Ruth received a letter in the mail. It was from Tom's old friend, a lawyer who had helped draft the original deed to the house. Inside was a note. "Tom always said you were the strongest person he knew. He'd be proud of you." Tucked inside was a copy of the deed, annotated with Tom's handwriting, a final, loving reassurance that the home was always meant to be hers. Ruth smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. She realized that her journey wasn't just about keeping a house or winning a court case. It was about reclaiming her voice, her dignity, and her place in the world. She had faced betrayal, fought for justice, and found redemption not just for herself, but for her family. And as she stood in her garden, the sun setting behind her, Ruth knew she was finally home. And as she stood in her garden, the sun setting behind her, Ruth knew she was finally home. The weeks after the verdict passed in a gentle, almost dreamlike haze. Ruth found herself waking each morning with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The house, once a battleground of anxiety and suspicion, was now a sanctuary again. She moved through her days with a new lightness, savoring the small rituals that had always brought her comfort. The first cup of tea at sunrise, the soft hum of the radio in the kitchen, the feel of earth between her fingers as she tended her garden. The fear of losing everything had been replaced by a quiet pride. She had stood her ground, and she had won. The family's dynamic shifted, slowly but unmistakably. Michael visited more often, sometimes with Ben, sometimes alone. Their conversations were honest, sometimes awkward, but always real. Ruth saw the effort he made to rebuild trust, to show her that he was sorry, that he wanted to be part of her life again. She forgave him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She understood now that forgiveness was not a gift for the other person, but a release for herself. Serena remained distant, her pride still a barrier, but Ruth no longer let it trouble her. She had learned that she could not control other people's choices, only her own. Olivia became a frequent visitor, often staying for dinner or spending the night. She and Ruth would sit on the porch, talking late into the evening about school, friends, and the future. Ruth cherished these moments, grateful for the chance to be part of her granddaughter's life in a way she never had before. She realized that family was not just about blood, but about the people who showed up, who listened, who cared. The support group at the community center became a source of healing, not just for Ruth, but for many others. She led the group with compassion and wisdom, sharing her story and listening to others. Women came to her with their own tales of betrayal and resilience, and Ruth found strength in their courage. She saw herself reflected in their struggles, and she offered them the hope that had carried her through her darkest days. One afternoon, as she was preparing for a group meeting, Ruth received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words inside were full of gratitude. "Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself," the letter read. "Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to fight for what's right." Ruth smiled, her heart full. She realized that her journey had become more than just her own. It was a beacon for others, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, there was always a way forward. Ruth often reflected on the lessons she had learned. She understood now that standing up for herself was not selfish but necessary. She realized that her worth was not defined by her family's approval, but by her own sense of dignity and self-respect. She knew that the past could not be changed, but the future was hers to shape. As the seasons changed and the garden bloomed anew, Ruth felt a sense of hope for what was to come. She looked forward to new adventures, to deepening friendships, to the simple joys of each day. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she faced them with confidence, knowing that she had already survived the worst. Would you have done the same? Ruth often wondered how others would have handled her situation. Would they have fought, or would they have given in? She hoped her story would inspire others to find their own strength, to stand up for themselves, to believe that it was never too late to reclaim their lives. One evening, as the sun set over her garden, Ruth heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Marjorie holding a small envelope. "This came for you, Ruth," she said, her eyes shining. Inside was an invitation to speak at a women's conference, an opportunity to share her story with an even wider audience. Ruth smiled, feeling the promise of a hopeful future. She stepped out onto the porch, the cool air brushing her face, and looked up at the stars. She was no longer afraid. She was Ruth Walker, strong, resilient, and ready for whatever came next. If you've made it to the end of my story, I want to ask you something from the heart. What would you have done in my place? If your own family took everything you'd worked for, would you have fought back, or would you have walked away to keep the peace? Have you ever faced a betrayal so deep it made you question everything you thought you knew about the people you love? Maybe you've been the quiet backbone of your family, always giving, always putting others first, until one day you realized you were being pushed aside. I know I'm not the only one who's felt invisible, underestimated, or betrayed by those closest to me. Maybe you've been through something similar, a family dispute, a painful divorce, a moment when you had to stand up for yourself even though it meant standing alone. Maybe you're still in the middle of it, wondering if you have the strength to keep going. If so, I want you to know, you are not alone. Your story matters. Your voice matters. Share your story in the comments below. Tell us about a time you had to fight for your dignity, your home, or your happiness. Your words might be the encouragement someone else needs to take their first step toward healing. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal or the triumph of reclaiming your life, let us know. This community is here to listen, to support, and to remind you that you are stronger than you think. And if you found something in my story that resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with a friend, a sister, a neighbor, anyone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. Don't miss our next story. Subscribe for more true tales of courage, justice, and redemption. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be erased. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for believing that every woman's story deserves to be heard.